I am in the middle of the Bell Museum in St. Paul, but I feel like I've stepped back in time. The year is 1917, and I am standing on the shore of Lake Itasca. Several beavers with their iconic, scaly, paddle-shaped tails stand in front of me, frozen in the act of chomping down trees and building a dam. The lake sits in the background, surrounded by a forest. This is just one of the museum's world-renowned wildlife dioramas. As I continue to wander around the exhibit halls, my eyes are drawn to something that looks like a huge rodent the size of a small black bear. But as I get closer, I realize it is actually the giant beaver, an extinct large mammal that lived during Minnesota's Ice Age. I can see the resemblance to today's beaver, except the tail looks narrower, and it is enormous. The giant beaver could grow up to 7 feet in length, stand around 5 feet tall, and weigh 200 pounds. I can't believe what I'm looking at. I had no idea this animal ever existed. I'm lost in thought when I overhear another visitor say that the giant beaver was recently named Minnesota's state fossil.
That's our newest state fossil, too.
Wow. Another thing I was totally unaware of. I set out to learn more about why beavers have been important to Minnesota history since the Ice Age. How have they shaped the landscape and human activities? And how did we get from the giant beaver to the smaller beaver we know today? Welcome to Minnesota Unraveled. I'm your host, Dr. Chantel Rodríguez. To explore these questions, I reached out to a paleontologist, an environmental historian, and a traditional ecological knowledge specialist.
I am Nicole Dzenowski. I use she, they pronouns. I am the paleontology lab manager at the Science Museum of Minnesota. Expertise is in paleo, but mostly sort of a lot of the hands-on part of it. I do have background in geology and biology and paleo, but I do a lot of the getting the stuff out of the ground and out of the rocks now.
My name is Hayden Nelson. I'm currently a Gale Scholar research historian at the Minnesota Historical Society. I earned my undergraduate degree in history from the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. Following my undergrad, I went to the University of Montana for my master's in history, and most recently earned my PhD in history from the University of Kansas. And I specialize in environmental and indigenous history in the North American West.
Hello, everyone that's listening. My name is Michael Waasegiizhig. I am Ojibwa, Anishinaabe. I am Bear Clan. I live in Wisconsin right now, but my family is from Wikwemikong First Nations at Manitoulin Island in Ontario, Canada. And today I work for an organization called the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, and I am happy to be with all of you here today.
My historian's toolbox, with its reliance on human-produced records, can only take me so far into the past. So I was excited to hear more about what a paleontologist like Nicole does and how they approach studying the giant beaver.
So paleontology is the study of ancient life, so sort of any ancient life. Generally speaking, we like to say that in order to be a fossil, which is what we're studying often, you need to be at least 10,000 years old. But that's sort of the only restriction or constraint. And depending sort of on what type of paleontology you do, the easiest way for me to explain it is sort of explaining the paleontologists that we have at the Science Museum. So we've got our curator, who is the one who does a lot of the research and the choosing what sites we're going to go to and what we're going to be looking for or researching at the time. I am the lab manager, so I am one of the ones who, again, gets the stuff out of the rock, and then whenever we bring it back to the lab, I'm the one who cleans it all up, puts it back together. And then we have a collections manager, and she's the one who takes care of everything and knows where it's all at. But that's just some of the few ways you can do paleo.
Paleontologists study the fossil record, or the collection of all fossils that provides a history of life on Earth. Each fossil is like a photograph from the past.
The fossil record for Minnesota is argued between 2.1 and 1.9 billion years ago to about 10,000 years ago. So at least in the state, that's where the fossil record extends. It's going to be different for all locations, depending on what rocks are exposed, how old the place is, right? Because we've got things like islands and stuff like that that are pretty fresh, geologically speaking. But yeah, so generally, though, the fossil record of Earth extends, at least I think, past a little bit older than 3 billion years ago. So that's going to include like all of the animals, all of the plants, all of the fungus that ever lived during that time period. And we do have fungus fossils and all of that stuff as well.
Where does the giant beaver enter into the story?
The giant beaver is fairly recent. The giant beaver showed up, I think it's about 1.9 million years ago. And it existed until about the end of our most recent ice age, which I think is dated to about, it's like 11.7. So it's like 11,700. So, but we say generally about 10,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. So,
okay. And so how do you know that?
Oh, that's a solid question. Okay. So you can carbon date things. We say, I think it's about 50,000 years old. If it's older than that, we're not really able to get data off of that. With things older than that, that's going to be our radiometric dating. So we are going to have things like zircon crystals, which they tend to be in things like sandstones in our sedimentary rocks, which we tend to get our fossils in. In the zircon crystals, you have uranium and lead. And then we measure the ratios.
And do we have a sense for their home, right? What the landscape looked like for the giant beaver, especially if it's such a huge 1.9 million to 10,000 years ago. Do you have a sense for what that looked like and if it changed during that time?
Yeah. So generally, that was the time that we had our most recent like glaciation periods in Minnesota, particularly. So the landscape didn't change too much. There were a lot of like sort of glaciation periods where the glaciers would come out and then they would recede back north or up north. So there were changes with that. But generally speaking, it was sort of this swampy, like lakey environment. It would be fairly cool. It was between like 5 and 10 degrees colder on average. But generally speaking, too, it was like fairly wet environment as well. So I would say temperate is not a bad way to say it. But the problem is, too, is they extended all the way up to into like the Yukon territory. But they did fairly well from what I understand, like in the cold. When it started to like get more arid, warm up and drier, that's when they didn't do so well.
So we have a sense for what they look like. We have a sense for the landscape and climate. What does the rest of the population look like? In other words, what other animals are living alongside the giant beaver at the time?
So there were a lot of the megafauna that we know. So usually in the same environments or usually in the same sort of fossil quarries or areas, they're finding things like mammoths. There are also evidence of like giant ground slabs, which we do have one record of in Minnesota. And then also particularly in a site in very close to us in the Twin Cities that I'm thinking of, where we found a giant beaver in the 30s. We were finding things like modern beavers were living alongside our giant beavers, so the beavers we know today. We also have evidence of things like raccoons, things like reindeer. There were turtles, amphibians. So it was not too different than what we would expect to see.
Now that I had a better understanding of the giant beaver's world, I wanted to know more about paleontologists' main form of evidence, the fossil. How does an organism's remains turn into a fossil? It turns out the process of fossilization is like a long marathon. It takes thousands to millions of years for a fossil to be made.
The very first thing that you need is for something to be buried, and usually it's a waterway, usually it's a river, so the animal will die. And then it'll kind of get caught up in an area in the river, and then it's buried super quickly, whether or not there's a flood event or if it's just sort of natural sedimentation that happens. Because there are things, a lot of times they do have time to decompose before they get buried. But once they get buried, there's not going to be any sinking, but there is going to be, throughout geologic time, continual like sedimentation or sediments being deposited down on top of that. So they will eventually turn into rock through lithification is the process. And a lot of times, usually what that is that's going to be things like groundwater that is running through the sediment that has like certain minerals that are in solution that will then act as like a cement and kind of cement those sediments together and turn that into rock. And usually that'll happen around the organism or around the bones. When we think about fossilization in general, it is the same sort of process that helps it fossilize. You'll get minerals deposited inside the bone. And then throughout time, that's what helps it fossilize. You continuously get things deposited on top of it, sediment deposited on top of that. And then hopefully, eventually, depending on how long ago this happened, you're either going to get uplift in the land, which then allows erosion to be the dominant process that will eventually erode down to the layer where you will find that fossil. Or you can have things like the iron mine where we have, they're mining stuff, bringing it up from the ground and then depositing there for us to go through.
Fossil evidence of giant beavers has been found all over Minnesota. Several were found in the Twin Cities metro area, including one partial skeleton in Hidden Falls Park in St. Paul. Other individual bones or fragments of giant beavers were found in Minneapolis and near the cities of Wells and Blaine, to name a few. How common is it for paleontologists to find fully intact fossils, like all the pieces? Or is it more so like, yeah, you're just really lucky if that happens?
Yes. When it comes to vertebrates or all of our animals with backbones, with bones, super, super rare. So yeah, if you do find that, you're really, really lucky. And even then, like a lot of times whenever you see the like beautifully preserved fossils where it's like a whole thing is intact, even then you're still probably missing a small percentage of it. So
that makes a lot of sense. And so then as a paleontologist, you do face the challenge of, well, I don't have all the bones to make the full. So how do you deal with that challenge?
A number of ways. So one of the ways that we do it is by eventually finding sort of enough pieces of different individuals or like at different quarries or fossil sites. So like an example of that is like when you go to the Science Museum, the very first dinosaur that was brought to Minnesota is our Triceratops. And that is actually a composite of 8 specimens, mainly 2, but it is a total of 8. And that's really, really common to do. And another thing is like it's super, super common to do like modern comparisons. So we're lucky that there's a lot of modern analogs to the animals that we're looking up. Like right now I'm putting back together an elk. So it's still the same sort of elk that we have today, but it is, is found in Minnesota. But I'm using one of our modern elk skulls to compare to get a better idea.
If modern comparisons are one way that paleontologists study Ice Age fauna, then what can we learn from placing the modern beaver alongside the giant beaver? Modern beavers have chisel-shaped teeth about 1 inch long. Their teeth are orange due to the iron in the enamel. This iron makes their teeth strong enough to gnaw through wood. It takes them only 15 minutes to chew through a 6-inch tree. A single beaver can chew down hundreds of trees each year. But the giant beaver had teeth that were bigger and broader, around 6 inches long. I asked Nicole how paleontologists go about determining the giant beaver's diet from a fossil.
There are some studies looking at chemical signatures in the bone collagen in some fossil beavers, giant beavers, and they found that they weren't actually eating wood at all, and that most of the chemical signatures correlated or were similar to modern aquatic plants today. So things like are semi-aquatic, like submerged and like just right around the edges of rivers and lakes, it showed that they were mostly eating that sort of thing. So the theory now is that they were living and existing very similar to muskrats today.
The muskrat is the cousin of the modern beaver and much smaller in size. It measures about 20 inches in length, including its 9-inch tail. An adult weighs between 2 and 5 pounds. Like its cousin, the muskrat eats plants and builds its home in the water. Back to Nicole.
So they weren't like ecosystem engineers in the same way that our modern beavers are. They weren't changing the landscape in the same way, but they were eating these aquatic plants that would essentially make more space for other animals and be really beneficial to the environment at that time. So I think I like to say that they were just kind of swimming around, chilling, living their lives, eating aquatic plants, and potentially doing things like digging in the mud and denning the way that muskrats do, but I don't think that we have solid evidence of that either.
I'm interested, coming from a historian, I know where to go. I'm going to go to various archives or libraries to find the records that I need or go speak with community to do oral histories. How do you know where to go to find fossils? Like, is there a certain kind of rock that you're looking for? How do you figure out where to find your evidence?
Yeah. So there has to be sort of like a lot of things in order for there to be potential for fossils there. So sort of one of the first things we're looking for is just, are there rocks of that age that are exposed? It's a little bit easier with our Castorides because Ice Age stuff, can be a lot more common to find in rivers, especially in the Midwest, especially in like Minnesota. But generally speaking, like we need to have rocks of that particular age. They need to be exposed, so they need to be on the surface, which is nice that we have had periods of glaciation. Well, that's actually not quite true when it comes to the giant beaver, but when it comes to some rocks. So as long as those rocks of the right age are exposed, and then we look at particular environments. So we're looking for sedimentary rocks in the right depositional environment. Usually that's going to be things like rivers, lakes, swamps, and that's because they're low-lying. And so deposition is going to be the dominant process. And with the water there too, it's always kind of pumping out or putting out sediment. So the likelihood of something being buried is significantly higher in those environments, and that's the most important thing in order for you to find fossils or for something to get preserved.
How do you know that there's something underneath and where to dig? Or do you just have to find it exposed? Or do you use some sort of equipment to be like sonar, radar to try and find something and then you dig to go find it? Just curious about that approach that paleontologists use.
Yeah, so what we do is anytime we're trying to find a fossil, we start by prospecting, which is where we will pick the area we want to look for, and then we will start just walking and staring at the ground. And then we'll be looking for bone. So if we happen to find bone, a lot of times what is happening is that bone is probably weathering from higher up. So we try and see if we can follow it uphill and find out where it's coming out of. If we can, then we will start digging ever so slightly. And if there is more, that's whenever we say, okay, we might need to do some excavation here. There is no equipment, no machinery that really can help you. We actually need to find evidence that it is there before we start doing any digging.
Giant beavers lived in the land we now call Minnesota until about 10,000 years ago. This is when humans are said to have first inhabited the land. Do giant beavers coexist at all with humans? Is there a little bit of overlap there?
Yeah. So we don't have any fossil evidence of like hunting or anything like that, but we do have evidence of like artifacts being found next to giant beaver fossils. And there are a number of like stories or like indigenous oral histories that do involve giant beavers as well, which is really cool.
Because of cultural protocols, not all native stories are meant to be shared with a broader audience. But my guest Michael did confirm that giant beaver stories exist within his native community.
I do know that there are stories in our culture about the giant beavers. I don't necessarily think that our people lived that far back that they seen them walking around, but I know they've probably found the bones and the fossils, of these giant beavers. And we do have stories that beavers actually built the Great Lakes. And there's another story about the beaver actually reversing the direction of a river in Ontario. And I need to inquire more and more about these stories. I mean, I've heard about them. I want to go to Ontario and meet some of the storytellers who know those stories, because I've learned over the years that Indigenous stories always contain some type of science, some type of physical phenomena. They're not totally just a fairy tale. They're stories that contain knowledge that our people needed and maybe even need today. So I'm really fascinated by some of these stories about how the beavers built the Great Lakes.
The giant beaver and the modern beaver shared a common ancestor about 20 million years ago. They evolved along different paths and coexisted until the giant beaver's extinction. We don't know exactly what led to their demise, but scientists have some pretty good ideas. The warming climate led to the wetland drying up. And with the wetland gone, the giant beaver lost its shelter and main food source. But the modern beaver was better equipped to survive the changing landscape because it could build dams and create its own habitats. It preferred to eat the soft inner wood of trees or tender saplings, rather than a diet of aquatic plants like the giant beaver. I spoke with environmental historian Hayden Nelson to learn more about the modern beaver and its impact on more recent Minnesota history, starting in the 1600s.
So the beaver, it's a pretty cute furry animal. A full-grown beaver is about 60 pounds or so, Although the heaviest beaver I've found recorded in Wisconsin, at least, I think weighed somewhere around 120 pounds, and that was I think trapped in the early 20th century. But beavers are amphibious creatures. They can maneuver on land and in the water, and in fact, they're quite awkward on land. They have short little legs. They kind of waddle about. They're not well adapted to land, but in water, they are quite well adapted. They have webbed feet, which helps them swim quite fast, actually, and their tail actually acts as sort of a rudder. And so they are sort of polar opposites in that they're very awkward on land and very agile in the water.
These furry critters are ecosystem engineers. Their two main constructions are dams and lodges. Beaver engineers use mud, stones, sticks, grass, and wood to build dams in streams and rivers. These dams stop or significantly slow water flow. This has many effects, including the creation of ponds. Beaver-made wetlands are a productive habitat for many species, like mammals, amphibians, fish, and birds. The wetlands support the growth of woody plants that beavers eat.
It provides more drinking water for animals such as deer and moose and elk. It slows the velocity of a stream if it's on a stream or a river, which can sort of suspend that sediment in the water and allow it to settle to the bottom. And it also raised water levels so that it increased the flooded acreage for the cultivation of wild rice as well.
The beaver is known as Chapa in Dakota and Amik in Ojibwe. Native people have their own culturally specific relationships to the animal. Michael explained to me how Amik fits into the Anishinabe's kinship model.
Well, according to our traditional stories, going all the way back to the creation story, we believe in a cultural context that we have kinship with all living things. We call the animals our non-human relatives. Sometimes we call them more than human relatives. In a lot of our teachings, we believe that the animals have been here longer than humans, so therefore they have a longer tenure, they have more wisdom, and they have more knowledge about the landscape than we do. And it would be in our best interest if we could learn from the animals rather than, quote unquote, try to manage them. I think there's a lot to be learned from not only the beaver, but other species as well. But that's part of our cultural philosophy, is recognizing our kinship with our non-human relatives. And then we go forward with our science and our management from there. In the language, we call beaver a mick. A mick. And in linguistics, a mick is a contraction. It's two words that are put together, which is amo, which is to eat something that is animate, and matik, which is a tree. So when you take amo and matik and put them together, you get a mick, the one who eats the trees. And that's our name for the beaver. And we say it very affectionately because we believe the beaver's been on the earth longer than we have.
Across the Atlantic, Europeans took a commercial approach to the beaver population. Beaver hats, hand muffs, and collars were fashionable across Europe, starting in the mid-1500s. Beaver fur was prized because it was thick, warm, and waterproof. When the European beaver population declined due to overhunting, traders eyed North America as a source for beaver pelts. The modern beaver lived all over North America, with population estimates numbering between 100 and 400 million. But this dramatically changed with the arrival of the European fur trade in the 1600s. From the 1600s to the mid-1800s, beaver and other animal pelts moved from the interior of North America to Europe via the Great Lakes fur trade. In the land that is now Minnesota, the fur trade involved traders setting up posts near Native communities. Native people exchanged beaver pelts for manufactured goods like glass beads and brass kettles. To fetch the highest price for a pelt, beavers had to be hunted in the right season. Here's Hayden.
Beavers achieve their prime coats in the winter. Like most mammals, they grow sort of a luxuriant winter coat. But as the fur trade sort of wore on, hunters and trappers weren't just taking beavers in the winter. They were taking them basically at all points of the year if they could find them, because they could always find a market to sell even subprime beaver pelts. And so that, of course, accelerated the demise of beavers.
Native men could efficiently trap beavers because they understood the animal's behavior and way of life.
Beaver presence is actually pretty easy to identify because you have these gnawed-off stumps of trees. You have, either a dam that you can see or a lodge that you can see. And so they're not that hard to find. And again, they're more nimble and agile underwater. Typically nocturnal, they do most of their work on land at night. And they spend most of their days in their lodges or inaccessible by water. There's a number of different ways that the native man, because the native men were the ones often doing the trapping, would hunt a beaver. So sometimes they actually used dogs. And the dogs would be particularly used if a beaver was living in a burrow along the lake or riverbank. The dog could kind of sort of root it out, and the native hunter could either spear the beaver or club it to death. Another method was, especially in the earlier part of the fur trade, was breaking the beaver dam and sort of draining the water in the pond or lake or whatever was dammed, riverway, if it was on a river, and draining that, and basically sort of leaving the beaver high and dry. And again, beavers are not that nimble on land, and so the native hunter could then either spear it or club it. Sort of later in the fur trade, especially getting into like the 18th century more, you also have iron and steel traps starting to become used more. Guns wouldn't really be used so much in hunting beaver. The last thing you want to do is blow a hole in a prime beaver fur, because that would sort of ruin it.
But how does an environmental historian like Hayden learn this information about beavers? They don't exactly leave behind written journals.
Yeah, I mean, I wish beavers would leave behind some sort of journal entry or record like that. So as someone who does environmental and indigenous history, a lot of the records from this period, the fur trade era, are from Europeans, right? And as an environmental and indigenous historian, we have to sort of read against the grain of these sources and try to find mentions that provide some sort of insight into either native people that the fur traders are communicating with or interacting with, mentions of the environment that they're going through. One example, for instance, is Daniel Grayson on Sur Duluth in early 1680s when he was traveling through northern Wisconsin. He was traveling on the Brule River, which is about a 40-mile stretch of river in northern Wisconsin. And he mentioned that in that journey, he broke through about 100 beaver dams because he had to in order to travel upriver. And so you look for sort of snippets in these European sources that you can then put in conversation with other either European sources or indigenous oral histories or things like that, and try to piece together a sort of view into this historical environment that no longer exists.
And would you say amongst the European sources, is there a most common source where beavers show up, right? Like whether it be a newspaper or a journal or what have you?
Yeah. So I look at a lot of like fur trader records, fur trader journals that they kept while traveling, through the region, or maybe they wrote sort of a recollection at a later date of their experiences in the fur trade. You also have missionary records, like Jesuit relations. Those are pretty good sources for looking at missionaries interacting with the native peoples that they're living among. And obviously the fur trade has, by that point, become the dominant economic force for those native peoples that they're living among. And so you can glean some things from those as well. And then also, obviously, like the fur trade officials living at various posts, like Michilimackinac, writing about the sort of overview of the fur trade that they're seeing as like a post official. So you get sort of a good blend in doing that, you get sort of this top-down perspective from these post officials like Antoine Lamoth Cadillac. And then you also get sort of a bottom-up perspective of the actual fur traders themselves, the people either going into the Western Great Lakes or into the interior and either living with native people or interacting much more closely with them to procure the furs.
When French traders arrived at the Great Lakes in the 1600s, they found native exchange networks and customs in place. Trading on native terms was the only way for them to succeed. An important native protocol that traders followed was the Ojibwe practice of reciprocity, which led to the exchange of gifts during the fur trade. Gift-giving created social bonds of mutual obligation. It turned foreigners into allies or kin. Native people had knowledge of the land, the beaver, and the best tools and techniques for hunting and transportation. And they were very efficient in the work of hunting and trading. For example, in the first half of the 1700s, native traders sold nearly 3 million beaver pelts to the Hudson Bay Company. Here's Michael.
The beaver were almost exterminated out of Europe, and that's when explorers started coming over into Canada, the English, the French, and the Dutch. And they began to make alliances with the indigenous peoples because the indigenous peoples knew the landscape. And the one thing that we had that they absolutely needed was the birch bark canoe. We built a lightweight canoe, which was light enough to be able to carry on your shoulders, but it was durable enough to carry a huge payload, say, 1,000 pounds of beaver pelts. And that birch bark canoe could do that. And the lightness of that canoe enabled them to portage from one river system to another. They were master builders. And everything about a birch bark canoe comes right from the forest, even so much as the wooden pegs that hold, the frame together. We were building those. We were serving as guides to all these fur traders. We served as guides with the Hudson Bay Company, which was the big trade company out of Great Britain. But also, too, we had native people that were guiding for the Northwest Company. But, there was a lot of conflict along the way. Our trade relationships with these different entities didn't always work out best for us.
Native men were not the only ones involved in the fur trade. Native women played vital roles as well. During the early fur trade, kinship was at the heart of the exchange system. Marriage created bonds of obligation and trade alliances. A French trader could become kin by marrying a native woman. Through marriage, his wife's family and extended family gained access to the fur trade. Success in the fur trade depended on these kinship practices. But native women also contributed in other ways.
Men were the ones who primarily did the hunting. They would also do processing of the pelts, but so too would women. Women would help process the pelts. But I think more importantly, for women during the fur trade, native women, they sort of served as the glue that held the operation together, right? They helped repair birch bark canoes. They gathered and provided a lot of the food that the fur trade ran on. And you can actually think of the fur trade as a sort of food trade too, right? Because these voyageurs are coming into native lands. They're not bringing a lot of food with them on these canoes that they have. And so native women are vital for that.
Hunting is not the only thing Native Americans did. They also processed and prepared the pelts to be traded.
So that would include skinning the beaver, removing its organs and whatnot, and basically preparing it for transportation to Montreal. And that included drying the pelt. Native people would actually also wear these pelts because the oils from our bodies would actually make the fur softer. And those pelts were actually the most valuable in the fur trade because they had been sort of worn and they're not like prickly or stiff, yeah. And they're sort of softer because of being worn. And then those furs, those pelts, would be packed into bundles that weighed 90 pounds. And that sort of gets into the difficult work of transporting these furs and being a voyageur, and the numerous portages going through Minnesota's lake country up north, paddling maybe a mile on a pond and then coming across a portage and having to carry your canoe and your 90-pound packs several hundred feet.
Transportation of pelts to Montreal began following the spring thaw. There, the pelts were loaded onto ships bound for Western Europe, where they were processed, fashioned into hats and other fur clothing, and re-exported across Eurasia and the Atlantic to the Americas. By the 1820s, changing fashions lowered the demand for furs. At the same time, the beaver population was in severe decline due to overhunting. The fur trade ended in Minnesota by the 1850s. Beavers, once numbering in the hundreds of millions in North America, had declined to an estimated 100,000.
By the turn of the 20th century, in Minnesota at least, there were probably less than 5,000 beavers. The naturalist Ernest Thompson Seton in 1926 estimated that Minnesota had about 2,200 beavers remaining.
Beavers began to recover from near extinction for several reasons. Minnesota and Wisconsin put bounties on wolves in the mid-1800s. They were seen as a problem for settlement and the development of agriculture in the region. They also preyed on beavers. With a significant decline in wolves, beavers had one less predator to worry about. Additionally, there were efforts to reintroduce beavers. For example, in 1901, 3 beavers from Ontario were introduced to Itasca State Park. By 1917, the beaver population had grown significantly. This is depicted in the diorama at the Bell Museum mentioned at the top of the episode. As populations rebounded, Native people were left to process the relationship with their relative, the beaver. Michael shares with me his relationship with a Mick from an Anishinaabe perspective.
I believe that because we were a part of the extermination of the beaver, that it costed us dearly as a spiritual people. It costed us almost our identities as Anishinaabe people. And I don't think that we've done much to, in a cultural standpoint, to fix or to maybe to heal that relationship. We still cling on to these old ideas. Oh, the beaver's a nuisance. They cut down trees, and they clog up the culverts, and they do a lot of negative stuff. I don't believe that we've always thought like that. And that's why I felt this heartfelt move to we need to go out and relearn our traditional relationship with a Mick, the beaver. And we have to learn to start seeing the beaver as our four-legged relative that does a job that we probably need to know more about, and we know very little. We only know about the inconveniences to our human lifestyle, but the beaver does a whole lot more than that, brings a whole lot more to the table than just that. So that's kind of been my mandate, is to go back and relearn that relationship and to understand my connection to a Mick better. I mean, I think there's been various storytellers throughout the last 50 or 100 years who had a story about beaver. But we've never collectively sat down and made a decision that we need to repair our relationship with a Mick, and we need to learn what a Mick does for not only us, but also the landscape as well. So that's starting. It's picking up momentum now. We're also reclaiming those old stories and those old traditions about, the four-leggeds being our non-human relatives. So that's becoming more and more prevalent as our culture and our language revitalizes.
The fur trade impacted far more than Native people's relationship to the beaver. It also changed their traditional ways of life. It
devastated, I think, a lot of the tribal communities, the nations that we had become so adapted to. We ended up losing our traditional ways of life. We can no longer hunt like we used to anymore because we were dependent upon trade goods. We lost a lot of our traditional hunting skills. We lost a lot of our indigenous knowledge about who we were as a people. And the thing that affects us even today is we lost our indigenous languages. We lost our ability to speak not only in our own language, but people back then were fluent in many different indigenous languages. And now today in 2025, we're part of a language revitalization movement where we're bringing back our indigenous languages. But they almost went into extinction.
When native hunters exchanged pelts for manufactured goods, they often did so on credit. As the price of these goods went up, hunters had to provide more and more pelts. Native Americans had no choice but to compete for market game. Each year, they took on more trade debt to survive and prepare for the next hunting season.
So basically, we were fighting for money. We were fighting for sustenance, survival. So it became a changing time in our life because we went from a society where we harvested food, shared food, and we acted as a community to now people accumulating wealth. And that forever changed us as Indigenous people.
Ojibwe and Dakota nations were forced to make painful decisions to sign land cession treaties in 1837. The United States committed to annual cash, goods, and services payments for the millions of acres of land they acquired from Ojibwe and Dakota nations. Ojibwe also retained land use rights for hunting, fishing, and gathering. The U.S. did not fulfill their obligations and allowed traders to settle native debts by seizing annual payments. Additional land cession treaties were signed in the decades that followed. To this day, Dakota, Ojibwe, and other tribal nations continue to petition the U.S. to honor the treaties. The protection of Ojibwe land use rights is where Michael's work comes in with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, also known as GLIFWIC. Their mission is to protect the treaty rights of all tribal nations in the treaty-ceded territories.
We work with 11 federally recognized tribes that are part of the GLIFWIC Consortium. And most of the treaty territory is northeastern Minnesota, the top one-third of the state of Wisconsin, and then into the upper peninsula of Michigan. So we have a huge area that we work in. And I've worked on different projects with the different tribes in these areas. But the leaders who negotiated those treaties said that, yes, we will cede these millions of acres to you, but we want our future unborn generations to have the right to hunt, to fish, and to gather on these lands that we're ceding to you. And those provisions were negotiated, and they actually got written into the treaties. And so Native people got to keep their subsistent rights in this region. However, that treaty was signed in 1842, and then Wisconsin became a state in 1848. The state governments did not recognize those treaties that were signed with the federal government. So almost 100 years went by where Native people were told they did not have the rights to hunt, fish, and gather on these lands. And it wasn't until the 1970s, until two young men from Lakudere challenged those treaty rights. And a federal judge in 1984 said, yes, we will recognize your treaty rights to hunt, to fish, and to gather, but we want to ensure that you're going to manage your natural resources just like the state of Wisconsin would.
His ancestors' decisions to protect land use rights in the treaties is grounded in the seventh generation principle, where every decision you make considers 7 generations into the future.
Well, today, the people that are alive today, we were their 7th generation. They were looking out for us all the way back in the mid-1800s. And so now we have almost a spiritual obligation to protect these rights and to protect what they negotiated for in our abilities to hunt and fish and gather on these ceded territories. And when I say ceded territories, that does not include the reservations. The reservations are in fact, federally recognized tribal lands. These ceded territories are the lands that were ceded to the United States and became public lands, private lands, state lands, etc.
Michael has worked in the Biological Services Division at Glyphwick since 2020. One of his goals is to bring traditional ecological knowledge into the organization's work.
So I have a master's degree in forestry, an undergraduate degree in biology, so I'm educated in Western science. But for the last 25, I'd say maybe almost 30 years, I've been on this path to discover the indigenous ways of knowing, indigenous ways of thinking, and for our people it'd be more like the Anishinaabe understandings of the earth. And there's not really a degree program in that. There's not really any credentials in that. It's just me going out and building these reputations with knowledge keepers, with elders, with storytellers. And over the period of a couple decades, I began to just barely learn what it's like to see the world through an indigenous lens. And then when I take that viewpoint and I combine it with my Western science lens, I think that makes me it makes me better articulate on issues like in resource management or in wildlife management, where I can see both the scientific aspect and also the traditional Anishinaabe perspective.
Both Michael and his colleagues at Glyphwick are applying this knowledge in the work they do with various animal relatives like the beaver.
And it consists of hydrologists, wildlife biologists, myself as a traditional ecological knowledge specialist. Many of us from different disciplines have gotten together and we meet to talk about our relationship, our kinship with beaver. And we use words like kinship and relationship, which are not real common words in scientific circles. But we have a very unique cadre of scientists here at Glyphwick who look at their work through the lens of Anishinaabe people. So the beavers are relative, not just a critter on the landscape. We, a long time ago, had a wolf management plan where we talked about management of the wolves in the ceded territory. We didn't like that term management because it was very hierarchical. It was very top-down. So we said, let's call it the wolf stewardship plan. But when we got to thinking about stewardship, that still is top-down, hierarchical. It's just like management with a heart. But it's still top-down, and it doesn't reflect our traditional teachings. So now our plan is called the Wolf Relationship Plan. What is our relationship with Maingan, the wolf? So we're very slowly starting to kind of change the words, to use words that are more appropriate, because in my belief, words are everything. Any word you select, can be very loaded with all kinds of assumptions and history. So right now we call it the Wolf Relationship Plan, and probably we're going to have a Mick relationship plan as well.
I asked Michael how he feels about the relationship between Western science and traditional ecological knowledge.
So there was a scholar back in the 90s. His name was Vine Deloria Jr., and I read most of his books. And Vine said in one of his books that it's really fascinating when indigenous knowledge and science agrees. He said it's even more fascinating when they contradict. And so I've been looking for those areas where they agree, and also with special attention to those areas where they contradict.
One of those contradictions exists in how communities are approaching beaver populations in the region.
An issue that we have going on right now is there's kind of talk in the state and among different communities that beavers are a detriment to wild rice, that beavers build dams and they can flood wild rice fields, and they're destroying the one resource that we consider sacred. And I went back and I pulled out my scientific side. I went back out and reviewed the literature. And I didn't find any scientific studies that said that beaver dams are a detriment. Most of the information I found was speculative, but it wasn't based upon data. It wasn't based upon facts. And so I began to inquire about what were our teachings about the beaver, from a traditional Anishinaabe perspective. And I wanted to basically take these two bodies of knowledge and compare and contrast them and to see why we believe what we do, and is there something missing from the picture, some understanding. And what I'm finding out is that there may have been a few cases where, a beaver dam has flooded out a rice field. But there's more and more observations to suggest that beavers actually build habitat for wild rice. And if you understand wild rice needs 1.5 to 3 feet of water to really for optimal growth. So, and beavers are experts at building these marshlands, and they can actually elevate the water. Yes, there may be a case where a beaver dam may flood out a rice bed, but we just don't have any data to show that scientifically. And unfortunately, a lot of our traditional knowledge is very fragmented, because of colonization, because of indoctrination and assimilation. But we're slowly but surely reclaiming those stories and that knowledge.
Michael's research on beavers and wild rice is in its early stages, but it is already receiving some positive attention.
I've done a few presentations on it, and it's really captured people's attention that we're looking at the beavers as a potential benefit, on the landscape. A lot of people say that the beavers are nature's engineers, and I totally believe that. I believe they're hydrologists in the strictest term. But we need to spend some time getting reacquainted with the beaver and actually consider, well, okay, now we kind of think we know what the detriments are. Now, what are the benefits? So, and I've initiated that process here at Glyphwick. And I think the University of Minnesota is following along. I think a couple of other organizations too are like, hey, that's a good idea. Let's see how beaver benefits the landscape rather than just constantly looking at beaver as a nuisance.
While the modern beaver played a big role in Minnesota's fur trade history, its distant relative, the giant beaver, has recently gained attention for its importance to Minnesota's Ice Age. The campaign to make the giant beaver Minnesota state fossil dates back to at least 1988. It did not receive support because the species name, Castroides ohioensis, is connected to the state of Ohio. The campaign was revived in 2021. Here's Nicole.
We put out a list of 8 fossils that were common in Minnesota and put it out to the state for a vote. This list of 8 did not include the giant beaver because I think they were pretty scarred from past experiences. But we did have quite a number of people write in the giant beaver. So we had that initial vote, and then a bunch of people wrote in. So then we set with this list of 9 fossils from the state of Minnesota. And we had over 11,000 folks in the state vote, and like a huge number of them, like just hands down, the winner was the giant beaver.
The Science Museum of Minnesota was considering 9 total fossils for a popular vote on what should be the state fossil. The winner would be put forth in the official political process for consideration by the state legislature. What were some of the other fossils? I know you already mentioned 2 of them, but the mammoth and the bison.
The bison, yeah.
What were some of the other ones?
So we had Terminoneris. Terminoneris is a Cretaceous age, so it's about 100 million years old, and it is a marine croc. We only have the snout of it that has been found in Minnesota, but it was found in the Iron Range, in the iron mines, so the spoil piles. It's the only reason that we have any evidence of a lot of animals during the time of the dinosaurs in Minnesota. And we also had a shark. I believe it's the crow shark. We had a brachiopod, which is a shelled organism. They look very much like bivalves, but they're not actually closely related to bivalves. They're still around today, but not in the same numbers. But it was one that was only found in Minnesota. Oh, and then the stromatolite, which was a lot of folks know as like Mary Ellen Jasper. But the banded iron formations are stromatolites, and that one was probably the most contentious because I think that one, too, is known and loved in the Iron Range area because it is where a lot of our iron comes from.
Giant beaver supporters did a lot of outreach to get the large rodent selected. A team from the Science Museum consulted with the native community.
So they would go and speak to the different groups and to get an understanding of how they felt about the giant beaver being the state fossil, because that was we had a lot of resistance getting it passed for the first few years, and that was one of the arguments is like, okay, well, how do the Indigenous communities here feel about that? Is that something that they want, something that they feel is important? And they did. They liked the idea of it.
Nicole and her paleontology colleagues also did a number of outreach activities to promote the giant beaver.
We ended up going to like a Bemidji hockey game because I think their mascot's the Beavers. Any mascot that had we went to a brewery in St. Cloud, a Beaver Island, anyone we could collaborate with that was willing to have us. We were there. And we ended up this past year, I believe it was bad weather, released Epic Beaver. So we had a beer that was released in hopes to help as well. Oh, the Bell Museum has helped us a ton. We've done events with them. They every year would help us out. So, yeah.
And so why do you think people were so attracted to the giant beaver?
That's a good question. That's a hard question. So some of the examples that we had up for a vote were things like bison and the mammoth. And these are they're not uncommon across North America in particular. There are multiple, I think, states that have those as their state fossils. The giant beaver, no one has this at state fossil. And then also another thing is, like we mentioned, since they lived up until about 10,000 years ago, they were interacting with the people in Minnesota. So there was that human aspect to it as well. So that on top of, I personally think it's because it's so cute. That's part of the reason. I mean, that's why I'm just so behind it. I think it's also really interesting and helpful when it is something that looks very similar to what we know today. You can relate to it really, really well. And speaking on the cute thing, one of the things is that it's the largest rodent to ever live in North America that we have any evidence of. So it's super fascinating in that aspect. And I like to compare it to our version of a capybara, which everyone knows and loves deeply.
Each of my guests approached studying the past and learning about beavers from different perspectives: environmental history, traditional ecological knowledge, and paleontology. I asked them to reflect on the importance of their expertise and how it might shed light on the role of the beaver in Minnesota history.
We're not taught a lot of Earth history. We're not taught a lot about how, the past, how things looked in the past, at least in the aspect of deep time. And I think that having a state fossil is a really good way to try and get people interested in the fossil record, in the geologic history of their state. Because, I mean, you kind of walk around and we all have an idea of what our state looks like. We know what Minnesota looks like. And it's wonderful and it's beautiful and it's also typical. It's what we see every day. So having a state fossil and being able to pull people in with look at this really interesting giant beaver that used to live here. That's sort of it's like a doorway, a gateway into getting people excited about just the state, not just now, but, for the past 1 to 2 million years at the very least.
In a pretty profound way, obviously native peoples had been hunting and trapping beavers before the onset of the fur trade, but this was done not for commercial sale, right? They hunted beavers, they trapped beavers, often in times of need, in terms of food, food scarcity. If they see a beaver, they'd hunt it. Beaver tails have historically been delicacies among the Ojibwe and other native peoples of the Western Great Lakes. And the beavers were also importantly used in ceremonial practices as well. The fur trade sort of changed that. It made beavers commercially valuable. In that sense, drew Minnesota into a sort of global economy around beavers. Beavers from Minnesota would be shipped to Montreal and then to furriers in Paris or London, and then distributed potentially even around the world. And so that rupture that the fur trade caused was in a lot of ways the first commercial activity in what we know as Minnesota today.
As somebody who's trained in science, I've come to think that science is the most evolved level of knowledge, and that we should always rely upon science to answer our questions and to solve our needs. But the one thing I've learned over all these several decades, science tells us about what something is made of and how something operates. But science does not tell us about our relationship with the beaver, with the wolf, with the wild rice. Science can tell us when something is wrong or when some ecosystem is out of balance, but it can't tell us how to have kinship with the natural world. And this is where indigenous knowledge comes in when we start talking about these relationships. Is now that we know that, what's going on with this ecosystem, what do we do about it? Well, science doesn't tell us what to do. Science just says, here's the problem, here's the solution. I would like for people to be open to different ways of knowing, different ways of seeing the environment, to seeing a problem. Indigenous peoples, especially my ancestors, Anishinaabe people, they had knowledge that got them through the harshest of winters without any heating or any type of modern conveniences, but they had the knowledge to get themselves through those harshest of climates and to be able to not only survive, but to thrive in an area just based upon the resources in the area. They learned how to conserve. They learned how to promote what we call today stewardship. Science is one way of knowing, and it's a valid way, but I think science alone is an incomplete picture, and that we desperately need a new paradigm for the world that we're entering. If we want to save the world that we have, or what's left of it, we've got to change our paradigm about our relationship and our kinship with the natural world.
Stepping away from the giant beaver on display at the Bell Museum, I make my way back to the beaver diorama. I'm still trying to wrap my mind around the fact that the giant beaver existed nearly 2 million years ago. It makes the fur trade era feel not so far away. Speaking with my guests, I learned how important it is for historians to expand their toolbox. Paleontology and traditional ecological knowledge provide valuable insights to the lives of the giant beaver and the modern beaver. Bringing together all of these areas of expertise helped me to realize that Minnesota has a deep connection to the beaver, from the Ice Age to the present. The modern beaver has played an oversized role in Minnesota history because of its prized pelt. By comparison, the giant beaver has received less attention, and the physical characteristics it shares with muskrats and modern beavers makes it all the more relatable to us in the present. As the newly minted state fossil, the giant beaver has become a symbol of Minnesota's natural history. You've been listening to Minnesota Unraveled, pulling on the threads of Minnesota history. I'm your host, Dr. Chantel Rodríguez. Special thanks to Rita Waasegiizhig Arndt for her help with this episode. You can find more information on this episode, including transcripts, bibliographic resources, and Minopedia articles at our website, mnhs.org/unraveled. Minnesota Unraveled is produced by the Minnesota Historical Society in partnership with Rose Productions. Our research team is Ari Fields, Alex Magnolia, Hayden Nelson, and me, Chantel Rodríguez. Our production team is Brett Baldwin and Megan Butner, with recording, sound design, and editing by Chris Heagle and Zach Rose. Our theme music is Careless Wandering by Arthur Benson. Funding for Minnesota Unraveled is provided by the state of Minnesota, the Legacy Amendment through the vote of Minnesotans on November 4th, 2008, and our generous donors and members. You can support Minnesota Unraveled at mnhs.org/support. Thank you for listening. Until next time, stay curious, and remember, the tapestries of history are all around you, just waiting to be unraveled.